Hey guys, tonight we begin with something rarely mentioned in the golden glow of ancient Egypt. Not the dazzling jewels or epic seductions, but the quiet suffering, invisible labour, and dangerous secrets hidden behind Cleopatra's palace walls. This is the world of her handmaids, women who lived in the queen's shadow, bound to serve her every whim, protect her secrets, and carry burdens no one dared speak of. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly connect with what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see how far this little storytelling circle reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, or just lean back and close your eyes. And let's step quietly into the perfumed, perilous chambers of Cleopatra's world, where being close to power didn't always mean safety. She was a goddess to the world, a living embodiment of Isis, draped in gold, her every step choreographed, every word weighed like perfume in the air. Cleopatra VII, Queen of the Nile, ruler of Egypt, lover of Caesar, and Mark Antony. But behind that divine illusion, those perfect coal-lined eyes and emerald-draped silks, were women you never read about. Women whose names are lost to time, women who knew the truth under all that honeyed grandeur. The queen never bathed herself, she never laced her own sandals, she didn't anoint herself with oil or perfume. That was the handmaid's job. And every day, it started before dawn. The first light of the Egyptian sun filtered through the carved stone slats of the palace windows, touching the cold marble floors before any rooster crowed. You had to be up before Cleopatra stirred, because if you weren't, she'd know. The queen was sharp even when she played at serenity, and if you failed her, punishment came swiftly. Sometimes it was a warning, sometimes it was banishment, and sometimes you simply disappeared. So you rose in silence. You didn't speak, you didn't groan. You crept like a shadow through the corridors of the palace, head down, bare feet cold on the cold stone, joining the other girls in the preparation chamber. That was where the day began, with scents. Boxes of myrrh and frankincense, oils from Nubia, jars of crushed rose petals and blue lotus. Cleopatra's scent was famous across the ancient world, but nobody ever asked what it cost to make it. The handmaids had to grind, heat, stir, blend, and sometimes for hours. If the scent wasn't exact, if it was too sweet or too bitter, if it clung too long to the skin or not at all, the queen would know. She always knew. One girl once used the wrong oil, just a few drops. Cleopatra said nothing in front of the court. She smiled, gave a wave. But later that night the girl was gone, her sleeping mat stripped, her name never spoken again. And still, there were harder parts than oils. You dressed the queen, not just physically, but psychologically. Every robe, every jewel, every twist of her hair carried a message. To Rome, to the priests, to her enemies, even to her lovers. Your job was to read her mood before she even spoke. Was it a political day or a seductive one? Was she angry with her advisors or secretly afraid? Because if you handed her the wrong colour, you'd made a political statement, and not in your favour. Some days she wanted to look like a goddess, others a widow in mourning. Still others she needed to charm an ambassador or provoke a Roman senator. She was never just Cleopatra, she was the empire's face, and you, her handmaid, were her invisible mirror. You had to learn not to look directly at her unless summoned. But you also had to study her closely enough to memorize every gesture, every breath. She liked her sandals warmed slightly before putting them on. Her bracelets must never pinch. Her wigs, hand-knotted and heavy, were placed at an exact angle, not an inch to the left, never too high. One day a girl trimmed a single strand too short. The queen didn't blink. But that girl was reassigned to latrine duty in the soldiers' quarters, which in Alexandria's heat was worse than execution. But all of this, the stress, the silence, the constant fear of being one wrong gesture away from ruin, wasn't even the worst part. The worst was the secrecy, because handmaids didn't just bathe her, they heard everything. And when you hear everything, rumours, betrayals, secret births, poisonings, foreign threats, you become dangerous, even if you never speak. Cleopatra was many things, but trusting wasn't one of them. Each handmaid swore loyalty under oath. But there were whispers, always whispers, that some were made to drink poppy water regularly to keep them compliant. Others, it was said, were watched by eunuch spies pretending to be mute, and some were simply replaced once they knew too much. Yet still, there was a strange intimacy in this life, because you weren't just serving a queen, you were caring for a woman. You saw her at her most vulnerable, naked, crying, bleeding, screaming, laughing hysterically one night after Caesar's death, wine staining her teeth and makeup running down her face. You held her hair while she vomited, you rubbed her legs during her migraines, you helped hide her bruises after angry political arguments, even though no one would admit they happened. But the line was always there, always. You were never her friend, never her sister. If she called for you, you ran. If she dismissed you, you vanished. And no one mourned a handmaid. If you died in service, overworked, overheated, poisoned, punished, kid, there were 10 more girls ready to take your place. Some were war prizes, others were daughters of traders trying to gain favour. A few were even born in the palace and never knew another life. To the outside world, Cleopatra was a vision of female power. But to the handmaids, she was a god you couldn't escape, not even in sleep, because sometimes she called for you in the middle of the night, for a bath or company, or to whisper her fears into your ear while you rubbed oil into her spine. And you couldn't yawn, you couldn't hesitate, you had to be perfect always. That was your life, silent, obedient, wrapped in the scent of luxury, and suffocated by the weight of secrets. The halls of Cleopatra's palace shimmered with imported marble and gold, but they were cold. So cold it seeped into your bones even under the blistering Egyptian linen. The palace was designed to awe, to intimidate, to make anyone who entered feel small. And if you were a handmaid, it worked twice as hard. You never quite felt like you belonged there, even though you moved through its corridors daily, brushed past ancient tapestries, stepped over lion-carved tiles. You were always reminded of your place, lower than the courtiers, lower than the scribes, even lower than the slaves in the kitchens. You were close to the queen, yes, but only in proximity, never in privilege. And the closer you were, the more dangerous it became, because Cleopatra's power was a spectacle, a delicate, deadly performance. And being part of that show meant you were constantly on stage too. Her every public appearance was planned down to the heartbeat. When she entered a room, it wasn't a walk, it was a procession. If you were part of it, you didn't just follow her, you glided. You carried perfume vials or fans made of ostrich feathers or trays with sliced pomegranate. Your posture had to be perfect, your gaze downward, your hand steady, and the queen never made a mistake, so neither could you. There were no second chances in her court. A dropped fan could cause a ripple of whispers. A misplaced glance at a Roman general could spark a rumour. Even if you were innocent, even if it was an accident, you were held to impossible standards. And the thing was, the queen needed you to fail sometimes, not because she was cruel for the sake of it, but because power, real power, is maintained by fear, by control. If she let her handmaids become comfortable, she risked softness. Softness invited disobedience. Disobedience was a crack in the foundation of her image, so she would test you. Little things at first. A missing anklet, a wrinkled sash, she might smile and say nothing. Or she might whisper to her chief eunuch, the same eunuch who kept detailed lists of infractions, silent rankings, notes on loyalty. You learned quickly that everything was watched. If you became too close to one of the queen's favourites, noted. If you were caught speaking to a guard, noted. If you lingered a moment too long in the hallway outside the bathhouse, noted. It wasn't just a job, it was a performance wrapped in paranoia. You started to sleep with one eye open, literally. You trained yourself to wake at the sound of soft sandals on stone. A single bell, a certain cough from the doorframe. These were all signals. The queen needed you. Now, no matter what hour. And the wrong response, a delay, a groan, a moment of confusion could be your end. Some handmaids developed rituals, silent prayers to Isis or Hathor, a lucky bracelet hidden under their robes, a chant whispered into their palms before entering the queen's chamber. Superstition became survival, because when logic failed, when punishments were handed out without reason, when girls vanished without a word, you needed something to believe in. And yet, amid all the fear, there were moments that made it even harder, moments of tenderness. Cleopatra could be warm, intimate. She could laugh like a sister, tease like a friend. On a quiet night, she might ask you to braid her hair and hum softly while you worked. She'd speak of dreams, of gods, of how the stars above the Nile whispered secrets to her. She could make you feel like the most trusted person in the kingdom. But it was a trap. Not always a malicious one, but a trap nonetheless. Because in those moments, You let your guard down. You relaxed. You said too much. You smiled too wide. And the queen would notice. She didn't want you to love her. She wanted you to serve her. Loyalty was everything. Affection was dangerous. There was one handmaid, Thea, who became too familiar. She had been with the queen since youth, knew her habits, her fears, even her favourite flower. One day, she joked. Just a little, something about the queen's jewellery being excessive for such a small meeting. Cleopatra didn't react, not then, but by morning Thea's name was erased from the records. Her sleeping mat cleared, her scent gone from the bathhouse. The lesson was loud, even though no one said a word. The palace functioned on sonance and suggestion. You could feel a shift in the air before you ever heard bad news. Whispers were currency, rumours were daggers, and sometimes you had to betray to survive. There were moments when you were asked to spy. Report what other handmaid said, repeat a phrase, describe a glance. The queen was always watching, sometimes through your own eyes. And if you didn't comply, well, refusal was as good as guilt. Even meals were a minefield. You didn't eat with the queen, but you prepared her food, you tested it for poison. Sometimes you had to swallow the first bite yourself. The irony? If she died, you died. If you lived and she thought you took too long to chew, you died. It was a twisted ritual of mutual dependence, but perhaps the cruelest part of being Cleopatra's handmaid was the glimpse into freedom. You saw things other servants didn't. You watched ambassadors from Greece and Persia arrive in gold-laced robes. You listened to poets recite verses by moonlight. You stood beside the queen as she sailed down the Nile, in a barge made of cedar, shaded by silk canopies, her lovers at her feet. And for one moment, you could almost pretend you were more than just a servant. But that fantasy was fleeting, because no matter how close you stood to the queen, the space between her throne and your bare feet was a chasm. You were not her, you would never be her, and in her world, that meant you were nothing. There's something no one ever tells you about bathing a goddess. It's humiliating, not for her, for you. By the time you became skilled enough to be trusted with Cleopatra's bath, you had already been broken into silence. You didn't flinch when she barked. You didn't blink when she stripped naked. You didn't breathe unless the room allowed it. Bathing the queen was not a sacred ritual. It was labour, anxiety, and the constant sting of knowing you weren't allowed to be fully human in her presence. You weren't allowed to speak unless spoken to. You weren't allowed to look her in the eyes unless instructed. And you certainly weren't allowed to react to her scars, her stretch marks, her days of blood or illness or shame. The queen's body was sacred in the public imagination, but you saw it up close, and it wasn't always divine. There were bruises she didn't explain, small gashes, rashes, and sometimes, when the stress of war or politics consumed her, fingernail marks on her own arms. She was powerful, yes, but also mortal, flesh and blood like any other woman. And that was the cruelest irony of all. The closer you were to the goddess, the more painfully you saw her humanness. And yet, you were never permitted to be human yourself. If you bled, you were expected to hide it. If you were sick, you worked anyway. If you were tired, too bad. There was no such thing as rest for a royal handmaid. You were her extension, and her body needed constant care. You washed her with Nile water mixed with crushed herbs and milk. You scrubbed her gently with linen cloths. You warmed stones to loosen her muscles and cooled her with fans afterward. Every motion had to be practiced, repeated, graceful, not just because the queen expected perfection, but because you had no room for error. Too cold, she'd glare. Too hot, she'd flinch. Too slow, she'd sigh. Too fast, she'd say nothing, and that was always worse. The silence meant you'd be summoned later in private. The queen didn't often scold in front of others, but she remembered everything. You might think you'd gotten away with it, until 3 days later, you'd find your daily tasks reduced, or worse, reassigned to latrine duty in the guardhouse. An unspoken punishment for an unspoken mistake. There was a day when one girl dropped the queen's ivory comb. It bounced once on the tile and cracked. Nothing else happened. No scream, no punishment. But the next morning she woke up in the outer chambers, no longer allowed into the queen's inner circle. She became one of the hands, invisible girls who hauled water and washed linens and spoke to no one. The message was clear. You were only as valuable as your last flawless performance. And the bodywork was relentless. Cleopatra had rituals, oils for her skin, salves for her feet, rare ointments imported from India. You applied each one in a specific order. using fingertips or feathers or gold applicators depending on her mood. And sometimes she'd test you. She'd ask a question mid-application. What was the third ingredient in this oil? What province did this lotus come from? If I were to poison a guest tonight, would this leave a trace? You learn to answer without pause, without visible fear. The queen thrived on control. She didn't just rule Egypt, she ruled you. Every gesture of care was also a test of your loyalty, memory, and obedience. But more than that, it was a performance. Cleopatra didn't bathe and dress alone because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't. To do so would imply she was equal to the women around her. And she wasn't. Not in her own eyes, not in anyone's. So you knelt, you bowed, you held her weight as she stepped out of the tub, steadying her arms like a throne. You dried her hair strand by strand. You applied kohl with a sharpened reed and painted her lips with crushed beetle pigment. You rubbed carmine onto her cheeks, made from cinnabar that could kill if used too often. But you didn't ask questions. That wasn't your place. Sometimes you held a mirror, a polished silver disc. You didn't look into it, only angled it for her, and she'd stare. Not at herself, but through herself. On those days she didn't speak. She didn't give orders. You could feel something hanging in the air, something tight and ancient and sad. You knew better than to ask what was wrong. You knew better than to offer comfort, because while you were allowed to see her bare, she would never be vulnerable with you. You were her vessel, her ghost, her tool. And if for even a second she felt you expected more, you'd be discarded like a broken comb. There were, of course, moments when your body was treated with attention, but never kindness. Sometimes foreign dignitaries would visit the palace. If the queen wanted to impress, she'd choose handmaids to stand behind her. Decorative, silent, beautiful. You were washed, scented, dressed like dolls. You held fans or scrolls. You smiled faintly but never too much. You were living ornaments. And if one of the men looked at you too long, it wasn't a compliment, it was a threat. Because Cleopatra noticed everything. If she thought a guest was too interested, and you returned the glance, even slightly, she might see it as betrayal. If she thought you invited the gaze, you could find yourself reassigned, punished, or worse, given away. You weren't her competition, but you could be her liability. That was worse. There was a brutal truth behind the palace walls. Your body was not yours. It was hers, not just in labor, but in symbolism. You represented her control, her grace, her divine authority. If you stumbled, you chipped her illusion. If you aged, you reminded her of time. If you died, she would not mourn. She would simply replace you. Still, there were rare, almost sacred moments in the stillness of midnight, when Cleopatra would sit at her vanity, hair unbound, and whisper, not to you, but near you. She might speak of omens, of dreams, of Rome. She might say things like, "He loved me when I was a girl, but now I must remind him what a queen is," or, "I watched my sister die, poisoned her myself." You didn't react. You couldn't. You simply applied the oil, or adjusted her headdress, or waited. And when she turned to look at you, really look at you, you felt both honoured and terrified. Because in that moment you weren't a handmaid. You were a mirror, a witness, and that made you dangerous. Too dangerous to keep alive for long. The palace smelled like honeyed wine and crushed lotus, but it was built on secrets. They were tucked in every curtain fold, woven into the gold thread of Cleopatra's robes, hidden behind every smile she offered in court. And if you were a handmaid, those secrets weren't just whispers carried on the breeze. They were weights tied around your ankles, pulling you under, day after day. You didn't choose to hear them. They bled through the walls, seeped under doorways, leaked from mouths that forgot you were standing right there, invisible. And the moment you knew them, you were no longer just a servant. You were a liability. There were the public secrets, the ones everyone pretended not to know. Cleopatra's affairs with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't mere romance. They were politics dressed as desire. But when she emerged from her chamber in the morning, with cheeks flushed and hair slightly tousled, it was your job to say nothing. You didn't comment on the scent of foreign cologne on her skin. You didn't glance at the crease of her linens. You didn't acknowledge the shadow of a man slipping out the side door before dawn. You wiped the wine stains from the marble. You changed the sheets. And then you bowed and asked what dress she'd prefer today. But then there were the darker secrets, the ones no scroll ever recorded. Cleopatra, for all her beauty and charm, played a deadly game. Every alliance was fragile. Every guest a potential enemy. and that meant poison was never far from the conversation. You saw it once, a tiny vial, hidden in a gold ring, passed from her handmaid to her advisor with a flick of the wrist, all while the Roman envoy bowed low before her throne. That night, the envoy never woke up. Died in his sleep, they said. Heat stroke. A tragedy. But you knew. You'd seen the exchange, and you had been told, without words, never to mention it. Secrets weren't just dangerous because they involved queens and generals, they were dangerous because they involved you. Once you carried them, you were marked. Not outwardly, not with scars or symbols, but everyone in the palace could feel it. Other handmaids stopped speaking around you. Eunuchs nodded but didn't smile. Guards watched you a moment longer than they used to. You weren't one of them anymore. You were the queen's container, and containers, when full, tend to break. There was one handmaid, Layla, young, quick-witted, fast with her fingers. She used to braid Cleopatra's hair with such precision that it was said the queen purred like a cat under her touch. Layla heard something real. No one ever said what, but one day she slipped a note under another servant's cot. That note was never delivered. Instead, Layla's body was found in the harbour 3 days later. Drowned, they said. A tragic accident. But her hands were bound with silk cord. You remembered because you recognised the pattern. It was from Cleopatra's private dressing gown, the one she wore when she didn't want to be disturbed. After that, things changed. The handmaids stopped whispering at night. They learned to speak without sound, tiny gestures, taps of fingers, a raised brow. Because if the queen didn't want something known, it would not be known, and if you learned something by accident, you had a choice, bury it deep or risk being buried yourself. But secrecy wasn't just about espionage and poison. Sometimes it was heartbreak. There were nights when Cleopatra wept, not dramatically, not like in the theatre scrolls, but quietly, into her own hands, into the linen of her cloak. You saw her crumble after news from Rome. You saw her rage when her ships failed to arrive. You saw her terrified, shaking like a girl after a dream she wouldn't describe. And then, minutes later, she'd stand up, straighten her crown, smile. To the world she was whole again. The Queen of Egypt, the seductress, the goddess. But you saw the crack in the mask. And that made you dangerous all over again. Because no one, not even Rome, was allowed to see Cleopatra weak. Which meant you carried her fragility like stolen treasure, precious, forbidden, and punishable by death. There were times when you were pulled aside by the chief eunuch, no anger, no accusation, just questions. What did she say last night? Did she mention the name Brutus? Who entered her chamber after sunset? Your heart would pound. Your hands would sweat. You learned quickly that the wrong answer could mean your life. But so could the right one, because truth was currency. If you gave it too freely, you became valuable. If you were valuable, you became watched, trapped. Some girls made the mistake of bargaining with their secrets, trading information for favours, a day off, a fresh robe, a better sleeping mat. It worked until it didn't. Those girls disappeared too. You learned to lie. Not just to others, but to yourself. You told yourself the queen was kind, that her punishments were necessary, that the weight of ruling made her hard, that her moods weren't cruel, just calculated. You had to believe it, because if you stopped believing it, you'd begin to hate her. And if you hated her, you'd slip. You'd sigh too loudly, you'd roll your eyes, you'd speak when you shouldn't, and that one crack in the surface would be all it took. So you buried it. Your anger, your fear, your loneliness. You became a vault, a living tomb for Cleopatra's truths, and sometimes she seemed to know it. There were moments, rare but real, when she'd look at you, not like a servant, but like a reflection, as if she saw the weight you carried, and pitied it. Once, after a long day in court, she placed her hand on your shoulder. "I don't sleep," she said, voice low. "Not really." I closed my eyes and listened for betrayal. You said nothing, just nodded, and in that moment you realized something terrible. You were both trapped. In her power, you in her shadow, but while she ruled an empire, you couldn't even rule your own fate. There was a cruel irony to being so close to power. The closer you stood to Cleopatra, the more you dressed her, listened to her, served her, bathed her, the more invisible you became to everyone else. You were in every room she entered. You heard every conversation, held every secret, touched the hem of every moment that would end up etched into scrolls by historians. But you You're a ghost, not even worthy of a name in the stories that would outlive you. You knew when she was lying, you knew when she was afraid, you knew when the perfume was for seduction and when it was just armor. And yet, to the outside world, Cleopatra moved through her life untouched, an untouched goddess, adored untouchable. The world didn't see the hands that brushed the dirt from her robes or washed the wine from her lips or held her upright when she stumbled out of bed after a sleepless night. And perhaps worst of all, you began to forget yourself. You had no possessions, no privacy, no voice that mattered. Everything you were, every talent, every thought, every dream was filtered through the narrow keyhole of service. You didn't laugh too loudly, you didn't cry unless you could hide it, you didn't even have your own scent. You were required to wear the same oils Cleopatra preferred. Your body was trained to disappear, even your emotions had to be calculated. Show too much joy, you were naive. Too much sorrow, suspicious. Too quiet, you were hiding something. Too lively, and you risked standing out. The line was razor thin, and it never stopped shifting. There was a girl named Nerita who once sang while polishing Cleopatra's sandals. Just a little hum, something soft and sweet from her village, far from Alexandria. The queen overheard. She didn't say anything. In fact, she asked Nerita to sing it again. And then the next day, Nerita was reassigned to work under the temple priestesses, far from court. Not banished, not punished, just removed. Because Cleopatra, they said, never wanted to hear a melody that didn't belong to her. You learned to measure every breath, and if you were lucky, you forgot the sound of your own voice. But that forgetting came with consequences. One morning you caught your reflection in a basin of water, just for a moment, and you didn't recognize the girl staring back. Her eyes looked tired, her skin dull. You reached up and touched your own cheek, not in vanity, but in disbelief. Was this what you'd become? Not a woman, not even a servant, but an extension, an object, a living tool in a queen's arsenal, and there was no escape. You couldn't run. The palace was a maze of guards, high walls, and loyal spies. Even if you made it to the harbour, you had no name, no coin, no protection. You were a shadow, a stray. In Egypt, handmaids were sacred within the palace, but expendable the moment they stepped outside it. Some girls tried. One climbed out a window using strips of linen tied together. She didn't even make it to the courtyard before she was caught. The next morning, the queen was seen wearing a new scarf, silk, dyed crimson. Those who recognized the linen said nothing, because the price of proximity wasn't just fear, it was transformation. You started to think like her. You anticipated her moods. You mimicked her speech patterns. You began to read people, watching for deception, for flattery, for ambition wrapped in smiles. You became a strategist, but unlike her, you had no board, no pieces, no victory waiting on the horizon, just survival. Every day was a test of endurance. Could you keep your face still when a Roman envoy insulted your queen in Latin? Could you press your fingers gently into her aching scalp when she had a headache and said nothing for hours? Could you ignore your own nausea while she dined on salted fish and figs, the scent turning your stomach? And worst of all, could you pretend it didn't hurt? Because sometimes it did hurt. It hurt when she scolded you for something you didn't do. It hurt when she smiled at a new handmaid, the way she used to smile at you. It hurt when she spoke your name with coldness like a stranger's, after years of serving her with trembling devotion, but you swallowed it all, because you knew what happened to those who pushed back. There was no justice in the palace, no fairness, only hierarchy, and at the very top was Cleopatra, brilliant, brutal, and beloved. You didn't get to question her, even when she made mistakes, even when her decisions cost lives. You stood behind her throne, lips pressed shut, eyes lowered, as generals bowed and priests offered praise. You held the tray with her jewelry while she entertained lovers, betrayers, both. You heard her rehearse her speeches, rewording, reshaping, performing her power like a musician tunes her instrument. And when she was tired, when the performance was done, it was your shoulder she leaned on, your hands that undid her crown, your fingers that massaged the stress from her temples. She'd sometimes close her eyes and say, "You're the only one who sees me." And in those moments, something inside you twisted, because it felt like love, not romantic, not sisterly, but something strange and magnetic. You did see her, more than any lover, more than any general. You saw her without the makeup, without the smile, without the power. And part of you wanted to hold that truth close, to be the only one who knew her, to matter. But deep down you knew she didn't love you. She loved being seen, and when you stopped being useful, when you stopped reflecting her strength and started reflecting her weakness, she would remove you. That was the price. You could be close but never equal. You could serve but never be served. You could witness her legacy but never write your own. And long after the scrolls are read and statues erected in her name, you will remain nothing but a breath behind her, a ghost in the silk, unnamed, unremembered. But still, you stayed, because the truth was, you had nowhere else to go. Inside the glittering golden walls of Cleopatra's palace, silence wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. For a handmaid, every whispered secret she overheard, every forbidden glance she caught, every private conversation she witnessed, was another brick in her invisible cage. Knowledge was dangerous, and in the queen's court it could cost you everything. Cleopatra was not just a queen, she was a symbol, a strategist, a living goddess in the eyes of her people, and in the ever-watchful eyes of Rome. Every move she made had layers. Every lover she took, every alliance she entertained, every child she bore, it all had consequences far beyond the marble columns and perfumed baths of her private quarters. And handmaids were there for all of it. They weren't just brushing her hair or adjusting her robes. They were standing silently in the corners of the room as secret meetings unfolded between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. They were there during the long, tense nights when Mark Antony returned from battle, bleeding, broken, sometimes drunk, sometimes angry, and always wrapped in the heavy weight of a dying empire. They saw her cry, they saw her manipulate, they saw her bleed, and that meant they were a liability. A handmaid might spend years earning Cleopatra's trust, but one misplaced word, one hint of gossip overheard by the wrong ear, could mean disappearance. Not a dramatic execution necessarily, that would be far too loud. Instead, they might be married off to a soldier and sent to a distant outpost never to return, or they might fall suddenly ill, or simply vanish between night and morning. The silence they kept wasn't honoured, it was exceeded, and if you broke it, there was no sympathy. Worse still, they were often made as keepers of secrets they didn't ask for. When Cleopatra prepared her infamous entrances, sailing down the Nile dressed as Isis, or unfurling herself from a carpet in front of Caesar, guess who helped her prepare? Her handmaids were the ones stitching the costumes, hiding the scars, scenting the oils that would make her unforgettable. They were involved in crafting the very mythology of Cleopatra. But their names would never be remembered. Their labour was invisible, their loyalty assumed, and it wasn't just political secrets. The palace, for all its grandeur, was also a site of deeply private anguish. When Cleopatra lost her first child, the cries that rang through the marble halls were muffled by thick curtains. But her handmaids heard everyone. They held her trembling body, they cleaned the blood-stained sheets, and then they were expected to forget. They were expected to hold space for both the goddess and the girl. But gods don't cry, and girls don't survive in the world Cleopatra inhabited. So the handmaids became part of a silent sisterhood, bonded by the unbearable weight of knowing too much. They couldn't confide in one another. They couldn't cry out when it became too much. They simply bowed their heads and continued. And what made it harder, what made it maddening, was that they sometimes loved her. Not romantically, but with that fierce devotion that comes from watching someone survive against impossible odds. Cleopatra wasn't just their queen, she was their flame in the dark. She was bold and brilliant and terrifying. She knew 10 languages, she debated philosophers, she seduced emperors, she made kingdoms fall at her feet. And yet, she never fully saw them. To Cleopatra, her handmaids were extensions of herself. Mirrors, shadows, tools. Even in her most intimate moments, there was always distance. The queen needed them, but she could never afford to get too close. Affection was a weakness the palace couldn't tolerate. Especially not from a woman who had to walk the tightrope between reverence and ridicule every single day. And so the handmaids learned to love her in silence. They poured their loyalty into their work, into the way they folded her robes, or braided her hair, or prepared her baths. It was the only language they were allowed to speak. Their own needs, desires, and dreams slowly withered in the corners of that palace. You didn't serve Cleopatra and remain whole. Many of them came into her service as girls, some sold by desperate families, others taken as tribute, a few chosen for their beauty or talents. But all of them became property of the state. Their bodies no longer fully belonged to them. Their time was not their own. Their futures were unclear. They were expected to be invisible, but perfect. The queen's moods could shift like the Nile's current. She could be generous one moment and ruthless the next. And her handmaids had to match her, always ready, always smiling, always watching. If Cleopatra looked tired, they were to soothe her. If she looked furious, they were to vanish. If she needed a secret carried to another wing of the palace, they were to carry it like a sealed vessel, with no leaks, no hesitation. And still, they could never truly win. If they were too plain, they were overlooked. If they were too beautiful, they risked jealousy, or worse, catching the eye of the wrong man. Cleopatra's lovers were powerful, dangerous men, and handmaids were often collateral in their ambitions. Sometimes a handmaid might be offered as a gift to a general. Sometimes she'd be sent to gather information through seduction, and sometimes she would simply be sacrificed to make a point. There was no protection from that, not even in their silence. The queen's secrets were not only dangerous, they were all-consuming. They devoured every trace of personal identity a handmaid might try to hold on to. There was no space for their own voice, their own story, their own heart. Everything they were became entangled with everything they were supposed to be for her. And when Cleopatra finally fell, when the asp's bite ended her legend and the Romans stormed her palace, who mourned the handmaids? Who counted the number of women who died, forgotten and nameless, in the chaos that followed? History didn't, but if you listen carefully, you can almost hear them still, moving through the cold marble corridors, smoothing the silks of a queen who never quite saw the cost of her glory. Inside Cleopatra's court, knowledge was not only power, it was peril. And for the handmaids, every secret they learned felt like a rope tightening around their throats. These were not just gossipy tidbits or idle whispers. No, the secrets these women carried could collapse alliances, trigger assassinations, or even bring down empires. One overheard conversation between the queen and a Roman general could mark a girl for death. One wrong glance at a scroll, one murmured name spoken at the wrong moment, and you might be gone by morning, your body dragged into the Nile's current, your existence erased. Cleopatra's world was built on layers of political deception, religious manipulation, personal vendettas, and statecraft veiled as seduction. And her handmaids, they lived in the cracks between those layers. They heard everything, they saw too much, but they could never speak of it. You see, the palace had its own silent code. If you witnessed something you weren't supposed to, say, a foreign emissary leaving Cleopatra's chamber long after dusk, you learned very quickly to pretend it never happened. And if you didn't learn, you disappeared. No warnings, no second chances. Many of these young women came to understand that their lives depended on being invisible, emotionally numb, and utterly obedient. If Cleopatra was Egypt's brightest flame, then her handmaids were shadows cast by her fire, silent, shapeless, always moving with her, but never seen for what they truly were. And in the darker corners of the palace, where torches barely reached and the air smelled of papyrus ink and melting beeswax, the secrets multiplied. There were scrolls hidden beneath floorboards, perfumed messages laced with poison, disguised spies pretending to be eunuchs or tutors. Even Cleopatra's pregnancies were state secrets, until she chose otherwise. And yet, the handmaids were expected to assist through it all. When Cleopatra met with Julius Caesar in secret, it was her handmaids who dressed her in the silks of Isis and lit the incense. When she smuggled herself into enemy territories hidden inside rugs or linen carts, handmaids helped prepare the disguise. And if a tryst ended in blood or betrayal, it was often the handmaids who cleaned it up. One handmaid, Neba, was said to have known Cleopatra's entire cipher system, the secret code used to correspond with her allies in Roman Syria. Neba was trusted. For a while, then she fell ill. Feverish and half-conscious, she began muttering names in her sleep, names that weren't supposed to be spoken. The next morning, Neba was gone. No funeral, no belongings, not even whispers about what had happened to her. Other girls simply walked a little quieter that day, because even loyalty had a shelf life in Cleopatra's palace. It wasn't just the queen's secrets they held. The handmaids also learned the secrets of their fellow handmaids, who was sleeping with a soldier, who was stealing oil from the royal baths, who was pregnant and terrified. And that knowledge was dangerous too. A simple rumor could break the fragile chain of trust. A careless slip of the tongue could mean a lashing or exile, or worse, being accused of witchcraft or conspiracy, both punishable by brutal execution. Some handmaids tried to form little alliances among themselves, whispering loyalty promises late at night in the textile rooms or near the servant wells. But these bonds rarely lasted. The palace taught them to be paranoid. It had to. The stakes were too high. One day, a handmaid named Teret was found sobbing behind the linen drapes in the eastern corridor. Her friend, Asher, had vanished after being summoned by one of Cleopatra's Roman advisors. No one had seen her since. Teret believed Asher had said something she shouldn't have, that she'd tried to warn the queen about something coming from Rome. Perhaps a plot, perhaps a betrayal. But instead of being rewarded, she vanished, silenced. And now Teret was terrified she would be next. Because in Cleopatra's world, to know a secret was to be responsible for it. And to speak it was to invite death. The irony was, Cleopatra herself was not cruel in the way of tyrants. She could be generous, charismatic, almost motherly at times. But she was a queen, one standing against Rome, defending her dynasty, protecting her son, and calculating every move with a cold, ruthless precision. She could not afford to be soft. So when her handmaids became liabilities, she didn't punish them with malice. She simply removed them quietly, efficiently, like pruning dead branches from a tree. That was the terrifying part. It wasn't rage or outburst that got you killed. It was silence, disappearance, the absence of a face in the morning lineup. And no one ever spoke of the ones who vanished. Even love letters were dangerous. Handmaids caught exchanging secret messages with guards or court officials risked everything. One was found with a wax-sealed note in her sandal, a note not even addressed to her. Just a courier, she said. It didn't matter. She was stripped, whipped, and sent to the salt mines of the eastern desert. A slow death sentence under the pretense of reassignment. Because secrets in Cleopatra's court were currency. And the handmaids, they were both vault and victim. By the time a handmaid reached her 20s, if she lasted that long, she had learned to bury things. Not just information, but emotion. Attachment, curiosity, even her memory. It was survival. She learned to smile politely even as she helped dress the queen for a royal feast, celebrating a battle she knew had been lost. She learned to cheer for Rome's friendship even as she heard of ships being burned in Alexandria's harbour. And she learned to cry only when alone, preferably somewhere no one would ever find her. The secrets these women carried didn't die when they left the palace. They lived in the backs of their throats, in the way their hands trembled when they heard foreign names, in the way they flinched at sudden taunts. It was said that a few handmaids, after fleeing the court, found work in distant temples or small villages, but even there they spoke in riddles. They never said Cleopatra's name, they never admitted where they came from. They carried the weight of her kingdom like a shadow trailing behind them. Because once you'd served Cleopatra, once you'd learned what was buried beneath the gold and incense and divine crowns, you could never forget it. You just learned to survive with it, quietly, carefully, like a secret. In Cleopatra's court, vanishing wasn't always about sneaking away in the night. It was about knowing how to erase yourself in broad daylight. For her handmaids, invisibility was a survival skill. They had to master the art of being ever present yet unnoticed, hearing everything and revealing nothing. The brighter the court's glitter, the deeper the shadows they were expected to sink into. You couldn't flinch at cruelty. You couldn't react to treasonous whispers or jealous plotting, not even when the queen's mood teetered dangerously close to rage. You saw what you weren't meant to see, you knew what you were never allowed to admit, and you held all of it inside, quietly, expertly, as if your mind was made of stone. This skill began early because girls brought into Cleopatra's service were trained to mute their reactions. If you cried when another servant was slapped for a spilled perfume jar, you'd be sent back, or worse. If you smiled when Cleopatra smiled at Caesar, but frowned when she argued with Mark Antony, someone would notice. You had to be consistent, you had to be unreadable, because the only thing more dangerous than saying the wrong thing was appearing to think it. There was no space for identity, no dreams, no goals of your own. Some handmaids came from noble Egyptian families fallen on hard times. Others were Greek girls gifted to the court through diplomatic marriages. Their names were often stripped or replaced. They became the quiet one, or the quick-handed one, or simply the girl with the honey-coloured braids. Their pasts disappeared. Their futures, not theirs to shape. And yet, here's the twist. It wasn't always punishment. Many of them believed it was an honour, being so close to Cleopatra, so near to her world-changing moves and impossible beauty, gave them a sense of power by proximity. But that power was a mirage. because the closer you stood to Cleopatra, the more likely you were to become a target. And if something went wrong, you were the easiest one to blame. Imagine this, you're carrying a sealed scroll meant for a Roman envoy. You're told to deliver it directly, no detours, no words. But the guard at the door stops you. You hesitate. In that pause, a rumor is born. Suddenly you're a suspect in an affair you know nothing about. One minute you're arranging Cleopatra's gown, and the next you're being questioned by palace guards about treason, or worse, Roman sympathies. Disappearing wasn't just mental, it was physical too. If you moved too loudly, you drew attention. If your perfume lingered too long in a hallway, someone would ask who passed through. Some handmaids practiced walking soundlessly, mastering the shuffle of silk on tile. They used oil on their skin to avoid the scent of fear. They memorized floor creaks and drafty corridors and watched which way the eunuchs turned during tension-filled dinners. And the irony? You were always seen when it didn't matter. When your hands were cracked from endless laundry, or when you fell asleep sitting upright in a cold hallway. When Cleopatra was in a rare mood and needed someone to scream at, it was usually the girl who stood too straight or looked too hopeful. That was the moment you were noticed. Never for excellence, always for error. There were whispers, of course, among the handmaids themselves. Soft fragments traded like gold during moments of stolen rest. Don't lock eyes with the queen during her mirror time, one would warn. She'll think you're competing with her. Or, always have a solution, never a question. These were lessons not found in scrolls. They were passed in broken breath between girls desperate to stay another day alive and unpunished. And yet, some couldn't disappear well enough. Maybe their face was too pretty. Maybe their body caught the eye of a visiting Roman too easily. Suddenly they'd be reassigned or quietly removed. The palace had a way of swallowing people. One day a girl would be brushing Cleopatra's hair, and the next she'd be gone. No explanations, just silence. The kind that made the other girls tighten their headscarves and lower their gaze even more. Even their dreams weren't safe. Handmaids who muttered in their sleep were shaken awake and warned. What if a secret slipped out in the night? What if someone overheard you muttering about Cleopatra's tears after a visit from Rome, or the bruises on her wrists after a violent argument? Your loyalty was tested not just in waking hours, but in your deepest subconscious. Over time, this lifestyle carved away at the girl's sense of self. One former handmaid, whose story survived only in fragments written centuries later, described it like this. I forgot the shape of my mother's voice. I forgot the name of the street I came from. I remembered how many drops of frankincense the queen liked in her bath, but I forgot what my own laugh sounded like. That's the tragedy. You don't just serve Cleopatra, you become absorbed by her. Your thoughts become her needs, your rhythm, her schedule, your identity, a ghost walking through corridors that don't remember your name. To survive, you erased yourself so completely that by the time you were finally dismissed or discarded, you had nothing left to return to. Invisibility might have kept you alive, but it came at a price, a high one, and in the stillness of night, after Cleopatra's chamber was dark and quiet, when the torches burned low and the scent of jasmine faded into the stale air, the handmaids sat in silence, facing the one thing even more terrifying than their queen, their own forgotten reflection. By the final years of Cleopatra's reign, the air in the palace was no longer heavy with the scent of lotus and incense. It was thick with suspicion. Rome loomed ever closer. The queen's lovers, advisors, and even family members had turned into liabilities, and once again her handmaids found themselves at the very heart of it all. One of the most brutal truths about being a handmaid in Cleopatra's court was this: you often had to carry death in your hands and never flinch. Whether it was slipping poison into a guest's goblet, testing a venom on command, or simply watching gently as someone was removed from the palace. Handmaids were more than attendants. They were tools of quiet execution. Cleopatra, despite her charm and legend, was a ruler walking a razor's edge, and when that edge turned towards someone, the blade didn't swing by a soldier's hand. It came on the quiet sandals of a handmaid bearing perfume, or in the soft whisper of a silk curtain drawn too early or too late. There are records, thin, speculative and whispered, of young handmaids vanishing overnight. Some claimed they spoke too freely. Others knew something they shouldn't. One may have seen too much in the queen's private chambers, and unlike senators or generals, handmaids had no name to protect them, no lineage to shield them. They could disappear, and not a single scribe would record it. Worse still, many handmaids were forced to become Cleopatra's testers. In a world of courtly backstabbing, she needed to ensure that what touched her lips wasn't tainted. It is said that a particularly favoured girl, no more than 15, died after applying a cream meant to soften the queen's skin. No one spoke of it again. A new jar was brought, a new girl assigned. The routine resumed. And while many saw Cleopatra as a sensual icon, the ultimate symbol of ancient seduction, her handmaids knew the reality of those beauty rituals. It wasn't glamorous, it was dangerous. Henna soaked for hours until it blistered. Lead powders dusted across faces and necks. Mercury-based treatments rubbed into the scalp to prevent aging. Who applied these toxic mixtures? The handmaids. Their hands cracked from mixing oils and charcoals. Their lungs burned from grinding lapis lazuli into powder. Their fingers trembled after hours of plucking, combing, and shaving. Tasks expected to be done flawlessly, or the queen's sharp tongue and sharper punishments would fall. Then there were the foreign visitors, diplomats, traders, spies, all of them expected to be impressed by the queen's divine aura. And the handmaids were part of that illusion. They dressed her, perfumed her, rehearsed her entrances, and were often required to perform small theatrical acts to add flair to Cleopatra's mystique. But sometimes those guests wanted more. A Roman official might grow too curious about a girl pouring his wine. A merchant prince might ask the queen for a companion for the night. Cleopatra was no fool. She knew the political value of such gestures, and often it was a handmaid who paid the price. The queen stayed sovereign. The girl served and suffered. Even worse were the assignments that involved espionage. Cleopatra, despite her brilliance, didn't trust easily. She relied on her women to gather intelligence, not just about enemies, but about allies, lovers, and rivals. Some handmaids were expected to slip into the quarters of visiting guests, steal letters, listen through lattice screens, or charm secrets from unsuspecting mouths. But if they were caught, there was no rescue, no recognition. They were disavowed, disposed of, and forgotten. This culture of silent obedience, of bearing danger with a lowered gaze, was not just expected, it was indoctrinated. From the moment a girl entered the palace, she was trained to never show hesitation, never question orders, and never, ever discuss what she saw behind closed doors. Loyalty wasn't rewarded, it was demanded, and the toll it took was brutal. Older handmaids sometimes warned the younger ones, "The queen is the Nile, flow with her or drown." It was both wisdom and warning, because when Cleopatra's favour shifted, as it often did, nothing could save you. Some girls learned to adapt. They became as cold and calculating as the palace itself. They perfected the art of empty smiles and quick hands. They whispered in 5 languages. They could braid hair and twist truths in the same breath. But even they lived with the constant fear of a single mistake. A spill, a misstep, an overheard word costing everything. By now, the palace itself had turned into a stage set for survival. Drapes no longer just concealed beauty. They hid informants. Pools no longer reflected moonlight. They mirrored threats. Every surface was polished, every vase placed with precision, but beneath the marble shine, rot festered. And for the handmaids, there was no exit, no after. They couldn't marry. They had no dowries. Many had no family left. Their entire identity was tied to the queen. If she fell, they fell with her. And the worst part, they knew it. As Cleopatra's political alliances crumbled and her grip on power grew more desperate, the weight on her attendants only increased. Her moods became unpredictable, her demands more erratic. And the palace, a place of golden feasts and perfumed nights, had turned into a gilded prison, with Cleopatra at the centre and her handmaids caught in the bars. Because in the end, theirs was not a story of love or legacy. It was one of sacrifice, unseen, unnamed, unthanked. Just hands that fed the legend, and sometimes died with it. The grandeur of Cleopatra's reign was not eternal. Like the mighty Nile during a drought, the river of her power slowed, then stilled. The queen, once the dazzling embodiment of divine royalty, now stood surrounded by crumbling alliances, political betrayals, and the looming presence of Roman authority. But while history speaks loudly of Cleopatra's final days, her alliance with Mark Antony, their defeat, and their infamous suicides, the handmaids witnessed something far more intimate, something quieter, and somehow even sadder. When the palace grew quiet, too quiet, The handmaids began to feel it. That haunting calm before collapse. The golden halls didn't glitter as they once had. The air was heavy. Whispers had given way to long, anxious silences. The queen's footsteps, once confident and deliberate, grew slow and thoughtful. Her eyes seemed always somewhere far away, and the handmaids, though rarely addressed, felt the weight of what was coming. Each morning they bathed her as usual, styled her hair, painted her eyes, draped her in silks, but there was no longer a Roman emissary to impress or a feast to prepare. The rituals felt hollow, like dressing a ghost in anticipation of a party no one would attend. Some handmaids hoped Cleopatra might flee. She had wealth, she had ships, perhaps she would disappear across the sea and start anew. But those hopes dimmed when they saw her growing interest in death, her conversations with priests, her kukkus, her cryptic references to old Egyptian funerary rites, her long lonely walks through the palace tombs. There was something unsettling about her gaze in those last days. Not fear, not desperation, just resignation. And for the handmaids, this ushered in the most terrifying question of all. Would they go down with her? Historically, queens did not always die alone. Servants were sometimes buried with their rulers, whether they wished it or not. And Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, may have had the power to order such a thing. The women who had once competed for her favour now quietly plotted how they might escape should that grim order ever be spoken. They no longer trusted one another. They barely trusted Cleopatra. But they continued their duties. One handmaid, who had served since she was 12, was tasked with mixing perfumes for the queen's final audience with Antony. She noticed how Cleopatra insisted on a particular blend that day, spikenard and blue lotus, a scent used in temple rituals. Another was ordered to gather fig leaves. Why fig leaves? They didn't ask. In the queen's world, questions could lead to punishment. Then came the day the palace gates closed for the last time. The Roman legions were near. Mark Antony, misled into believing Cleopatra was dead, took his own life. And when she heard the news, something inside the queen seemed to break, gently but completely. The handmaids were present when she had herself carried to the mausoleum. They helped her dress in ceremonial robes, placed the crown upon her head, draped her in jewellery once worn by the goddess Isis herself. One of the handmaids, perhaps the closest to her, handed her a small basket of figs. Inside, legend says, was hidden an asp. Whether the snake truly bit her or whether poison was hidden in one of the ornate hairpins, we may never know. But what matters is this: the handmaids stayed. 2 of them, at least, were found dead alongside their queen, their names forgotten, their loyalties never rewarded, their stories untold. We'll never know whether they chose to follow her into death, or whether they were given no choice at all, whether they believed in the afterlife Cleopatra promised, or simply saw no future without her. But in that quiet, sealed chamber, as Rome claimed the palace and history closed the chapter on Egypt's ancient rule, those handmaids became part of something vast and sorrowful. Their final moments weren't witnessed by scribes or diplomats. They weren't marked by parades or songs, but they mattered, because they were the last breath of a world that had glittered with gold and power and myth, and ended softly in silence. And so, while Cleopatra's name echoes through the centuries, her handmaids remain shadows behind the throne, buried beneath perfume and duty, lost in the folds of silk and secrecy. It sucked to be Cleopatra's handmaid, not because of a single tragedy, but because their entire lives were spent in devotion to someone else's glory, someone else's story. They served a queen worshipped as divine, and yet died as footnotes. But tonight we remember them, not as servants, but as survivors, as women who lived in the eye of one of history's greatest storms and vanished with the wind. And that was the hidden world behind Cleopatra's throne. Not the power or the pageantry, but the quiet, complicated lives that history forgot. If you enjoyed this journey tonight, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. And now, no more screens, no more queens. Close your eyes, let the past fade, and get some sleep. You've earned it.